Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. When I got an advance copy of the new Haruki Murakami novel, The City and Its Uncertain Walls, it sat for a while on a stack on my desk like so many other books do. But I picked it up and started thumbing through it, and all of a sudden I found myself entranced. His language just has a way of pulling you in, which I'm sure is not news to his longtime fans. Now, Murakami doesn't do many interviews, but I got the chance to ask him some questions over email. You can check that out at npr.org. But I also spoke with his longtime editor, Lexy Bloom, about what it's like working with him, how his voice and his writing has evolved over the years, and how this new novel has him seriously considering his mortality. That's up ahead.
This message comes from Carvana. Whether you need weeks to research the perfect car or know exactly what you want, Carvana makes car buying easy. Choose from Carvana's massive inventory using customizable search tools. However you buy your car with Carvana.
Hi, I'm Catherine Marr, CEO of NPR, where we're guided by a bold mission to create a more informed public. Join us today by giving at donate.npr.org.
Lexy Bloom, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What was the first Murakami book you read?
The first book by Murakami that I read was A Wild Sheep Chase, and it totally blew my mind. In 1995, there wasn't a lot available to read from Murakami. It had only been 6 years since A Wild Sheep Chase had been published in English, then by Kodansha International. What I did, because he was also being published in The New Yorker at that point, was I got a subscription to The New Yorker, and I used to play this somewhat embarrassing game with myself. This is the true sign of a translation nerd. So every time there was a new story by Murakami in The New Yorker, and there was a fair amount at that point because Bill Buford had just taken over the fiction department, and he was a big Murakami fan and was publishing a fair amount. So I'd read the story first before I would look at the translator to see if I could figure out who had translated it, because I was aware at that point that he had 3 translators at that time, Alfred Birnbaum, Jay Rubin, and Phil Gabriel, and they all had really distinct styles. So I'd try and figure out who had translated it before I actually looked at the translator name.
Oh my goodness. How good were you at this game?
I got pretty good.
Okay, all right. And so, were you interested? You said you'd read this you'd read him at a Japanese literature class. How many years until you actually got to work with the guy?
So it was a little while. It was 2010, and at that point, I was an editor at Vintage, the paperback imprint at Knopf. My then boss, the late Sonny Mehta, he said finally, "I hear you like Murakami," and I said, "Yes, I do. I love his work." And he said, "We have a new novel, and we want you to help us with it." And he pointed to a stack of paper on his desk, and it was an enormous stack of paper. It was 1,400 pages. It was very tall, and it was the manuscript for 1QA4. It's always, as an editor, really exciting, but daunting and challenging to work with someone whose writing you really revere.
Mm-hmm. How does it actually work to edit a translated work? Are you reading the original Japanese, or are you?
I'm not. I don't read Japanese.
Yeah, so you're reading the translated bit?
That's right. So I'm reading the unedited translation, and I'm working with Murakami's translators.
So do you consider yourself an editor of Murakami or an editor of his translators?
That's a great question. I think I'm editing his translations, though depending on the book, my feedback always goes to Murakami. And so occasionally, especially with something like 1Q84, it was a very long book. And in Japan, it had been published, there's 3 parts to it, and it was published in 3 separate books. So the first 2 books were published at one time, and then the third book, which he was still writing when the first 2 came out, was published later. So the third book feels really different from the first 2, and we published them all in 1 volume. So for that book, I did more editing, trimming, cutting out repetition, asking questions about things that maybe weren't consistent from the first 2 to the third book. So that was more of an editorial project with some bigger picture edits than a straightforward novel or short story collection where I am editing the translations alone.
This book has, some like touchstone Murakami themes, right? There's like love and memory and longing. There's a lot about reading, obviously. What do you think draws him to those themes?
I think if he were asked that question, he probably wouldn't be able to answer because I don't think he sees his work that way. He's said as much in interviews himself. I can't speak for him. But I think, we all have themes that preoccupy us, right? And so for him, whether it's this idea of do we slip between realities? What is real and what's not? The many parallel worlds that we see in his fiction, or the idea of longing for a lost love. We see that in his work a lot, and that's one of the things that I find most profound in The City and Its Uncertain Walls, this beautiful nostalgia that is shot through the entire book.
Yeah. And as someone who was like a longtime fan and now has worked with him for a long time, how do you think his approach to those themes has evolved over time?
I find with his books that there's always something surprising in them, and I've read them all, and I love reading every time there's a new book. It's thrilling to me again because there's always something exciting in it. There's always this, more than most writers I know, he draws these worlds that allow you to lose yourself in them. They're so immersive, and that's such an unusual skill, and I think he does it in part because he has these kind of, fantastical worlds, and there's, unicorns and shadow selves in this new book. But then there's also the pull of human emotions. And so it's that combination, I think, of like the force of his imagination and then like the gravitational pull of the human emotions that kind of balance it out. And I've never really come across a writer who's done that so effectively.
I'm sure you're no stranger to the sort of like feminist criticisms of him, right? And how he presents female characters. And I've read interviews where he's asked about it. He kind of like brushes it off. What do you make of those criticisms?
I mean, as you say, he has addressed this before a number of times. He's on public record about it. And I highly recommend reading his 2020 interview. It's in LitHub with the writer Miyako Kawakami, who's a young Japanese feminist writer. She's best known for her novel Breasts and Eggs. That's a really thoughtful conversation about the women in his work. And I can't speak for other readers, but I know from my work with him that he doesn't see any of his characters, male or female, the way the rest of us do. I don't think he sees them as representative or complex. He's just more interested in the way that they engage with the world and the events that kick off as a result. And, as I was saying before, in his work, it's sliding between these two parallel realities makes perfect sense. It's a reflection on the world we live in. And he's even talked about his own writing as sort of dreaming while you're awake. So I don't think he sees the world the way the rest of us do. And that's why we have his amazing books as a result.
Is this like a case of... I don't know how I want to phrase this. Sometimes when it comes to translated literature, I'm wary of looking at the work through a Western-centric,
yeah, absolutely,
position, and like reading through translated novels through the prism of like American or Western criticism seems a bit myopic at times.
Yep.
And I'm curious if that's something that happens to Murakami.
I think that's definitely a piece of it. Yeah. He is, I think because his writing is so global, his references are so global. I can't remember who said it, but someone referred to him in an early review as like one of the first sort of truly global superstar writers, and he's referencing the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and he's writing about everyone from, Kafka to Raymond Carver. So we think of him sometimes as an American writer because so many of his pop culture references are American, but he's not. He's a Japanese writer. And so we do have to remember that sometimes as we read his work through the prism of, our American viewpoint.
How has he maintained this longevity?
Number one, he's fairly prolific, and he's prolific unusually in different genres. He writes long novels, he writes short novels, he writes short stories, and he writes nonfiction. So I think that keeps it interesting for writers. I find when I talk to people about Murakami, The books that they most commonly reference are obviously Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Norwegian Wood, his two most famous novels, two really different types of novels too. One very realistic Norwegian Wood love story, and Wind Up Bird is just the most fantastical, imaginative book I've read, or one of them. But then they also always talk to me about his running book. I think that book holds a special place in readers' hearts, and I don't know if it's because so many of his readers are runners. I also was a runner for many years, and I think there's something in the way that he writes, and you kind of go on his journey with him that makes sense for people who run. You kind of go into your own head. But so I think that's part of it is kind of range in the kind of books that he writes, because it's so varied. And most writers can't do that successfully, and he does it incredibly well. And I think with the nonfiction, too, people are always looking for like a glimpse of what's going on in his mind. The running book is so personal because you do get a sense of how he thinks. And then, he's written about classical music. We published a book. He has a great passion for collecting T-shirts that he picks up at vintage stores for like $1. We did a, kind of illustrated book that he had fun with about his T-shirt collecting. But at the core of it all are the novels. And those are just these truly immersive worlds that, as you say, you can't tear yourself away from. And in our world now, especially, that's pretty rare. We're all so distracted all the time. And there's the pull of social media and there's the news. And so to be able to truly lose yourself in a great story, that's a very special thing.
I feel like this book, The City and Its Uncertain Walls, with him like revisiting a previous work, kind of has him thinking about his legacy and his life in a way. Like he's reached a certain point in his life. I'm curious, have you talked to him about what the end goal looks like?
No, that's not a question I would ask, but I can say that there's an afterword at the end of this book, which is unusual. And in the afterword, he talks about sort of how he came to write this book. And so the origins of this book are in a novella that he wrote in 1980. It was published in a Japanese magazine. And then the novella went one direction and he wrote Hard-Boiled Wonderland. But he says that he always felt that it was unfinished, that this novella was meant to become something else. He says something about how it stuck in his throat like a fishbone. And so during the pandemic, he's home, he's not going out, and he finally decides it's the time to turn back to that novella and to write this story. And so I think you feel the isolation of the pandemic moment in time in this book. You feel the kind of claustrophobia that we all felt. And he had to write this story, and so it became like the perfect moment for him to do it. And so you do see him sort of grappling with something that he worked on a long time ago, and now as an older writer is coming back to. And without giving anything about the book away, there's this incredibly beautiful, moving scene towards the end where the main character is walking through a river, and he sort of gradually becoming younger and becoming his younger self again. And I found that so profound. It's something as you grow older you think about. You can't ever be your younger self again, but sometimes you wish you could. And so you see him, I think, as an older, more mature writer looking back on his younger self there.
What do you think his legacy will be?
I hope that people continue to read him and love his work the way they do now. As a publisher in the U.S. alone, we've sold more than 6 million copies of his work. And that's amazing. For a writer in translation who's best known for creating these kind of worlds based around parallel realities, to have that kind of global success, and that's just in the U.S. He's published in, I can't remember how many languages. I think it's more than 60. I just hope people continue to read him and love him and lose themselves in his work, and also to discuss his books, to have the beauty of a discussion about, well, this is my favorite, but I don't love this one as much. Everyone has their own opinion, and I love that. I prefer that to when everyone agrees that, there's one favorite book.
Lexy Bloom, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And just a reminder that signing up for Book of the Day Plus is a great way to support NPR's book coverage and public media, and you'll get to listen to every episode sponsor-free. So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/Book of the Day.
All this year, NPR traveled the country, hearing from voters not just about the issues, but about their hopes for the country's future.
We should be able to disagree with each other without bullying each other into submission.
And what it means to be a part of a democracy. Invest in coverage that moves us forward together by giving today at donate.npr.org.
Hi, I'm Ramteen Arablouei from Throughline. Electricity, internet, cell service, all the things we rely on every day can be unreliable or inaccessible in an emergency. But through any storm or crisis, radio is a lifeline. Support the resource that's here for you no matter what. Give today at donate.npr.org.
Hey everybody, it's time to join NPR's All Songs Considered as we celebrate a very tolerable Christmas with a mix of seasonal songs and special guests.
Yeah, we're in for like the saddest Christmas ever, stuck with Robin, who is basically a lump of coal in the shape of a man.
Hear new episodes of All Songs Considered every Tuesday, wherever you get podcasts.